Hi everybody, welcome to topic 4 of Unit 3. Today's topic is called Extremist Regimes in Defining a Nation, and I know we've looked already this semester a couple of times at countries that use sports to try and show that there's something collective about themselves, right, through jerseys or national identity, where countries are using sports to push for success, like Australia and their program to get in the tops of the global medal counts. This is a little bit different because in this case we're looking at regimes that came onto the scene in the 20th century with some sort of new political, economic, and or social idea. And they wanted to define not just their nation, but defining themselves, their ideologies as successful. You sort of have two audiences in this case, like we've looked at before with sports space. You have a domestic audience. In other words, you want to convince your own polity, your own society, your own citizenry that your ideas are worth pursuing, that they're being successful. So yes, you hope your economy is going to turn around and do really well. You hope you're going to have successful foreign affairs. Yes, but in sports, you're going to want to have success too, to show that your country can produce those top people. Second, you want to show external constituencies, other countries, that your ideas are working. And the way they want to show they're working is if you have some sort of definition where your people are supposed to be physically fit, they're supposed to be strong, and your ideology is tied to that, then you need to have some physical success there too, and that's where sports comes in. You also want to export your ideas, right? So, for example, when the Soviets were firmly established in the 1920s, one of the first things they did was organize something called the Comintern, which is the Communist International arm. Their job was to help coach other organizations in other countries along the way of converting their society into something more like the Soviets. Hopefully they'll have some tangible success to show for how they organize their society and whatnot. And that's why you're going to turn to sports here with extremist regimes and defining a nation. Now, one of the things that's true here with this topic is that you don't really have a monopoly on these sorts of ideas of tying sports to extremist regimes, whether you're on the political right or the political left. Pretty much once you can become extreme to the right or to the left, you end up in the same part of a continuum where you have a command economy, a dictator at the core, or a small junta at the core, where you have basically ideologies of the right and ideologies of the left end up in the same sort of place with command and centralized systems. The same thing happens with sports. So if you're going to try and use this to prove your success on the right or the left, the way you govern sport will be sort of the same. You're going to set up countrywide academies where you're going to pull in the youngest people to start performing in sports at a young age. You're going to have them maybe go to school, maybe not go to school, but train alongside their peers with the top coaches so that you end up with people who are ready to be world-class athletes by the time they reach the peak in their given athletic career. And so that could be quite young if you're, say, a gymnast in Romania. It could be much older if you're a hockey player in the Soviet Union, or even at the end of the Soviet Union, they also had academies set up for chess players where they were trying to have a lot of grandmasters, so that could happen at different ages. The first person who tried to do this, the first regime that tried to do this in the 20th century was Benito Mussolini, who's pictured here on the right, in fascist Italy. Mussolini came to the fore with his fascists in the late 1920s, and they had several pillars where they were going to try and organize their society and their polity in new and interesting ways. Now, one of the things that he and his cabinet ministers were extremely physically fit, and they believed that their populace, as one of their 5 key pillars, the 5 key things they were working on, their populace should be physically fit. They should be the strongest and best in the world. So they had actually an exercise regime where workers were required to come out on breaks during the day to do calisthenics, and where they were going to become great at other sports as well. And they set up for the 10th Olympiad in Los Angeles in 1932 as the sort of coming out party. Now, Los Angeles is a long way from Italy when you're in the pre-jet airplane age, and they had to get on cruise ships and go to compete in the Olympics. Actually quite successful. They also hosted the World Cup in 1934. It was the second World Cup, which they won. And there's certainly several apocryphal stories about how Mussolini approached that tournament. And some people argue that he stacked the draw and then set up favorable refereeing situations. The perhaps apocryphal quote is that him telling the head of the referees that Italy must win the World Cup, and they said, we understood, and he said, no, you need to hear me. Italy must win the World Cup, and so that they were going to make sure they're going to have success, right, whether they had to get it in any way they could. So this is their ideology, right? And they're going to be successful because when they go to the Olympics in 1932, they're going to finish second in the medal count, and we'll look a little bit more about that here in a little bit. Once they're on the scene and they've got their idea in place, you've got Nazi Germany close on their heels. So this is an interesting one because the Olympics is an all-comer sort of situation. And it's a little different for the Nazis than the fascists as well because they hosted the Olympics in 1936. So it's going to give them a chance to really demonstrate a lot of what they think is great about themselves and communicate that to the rest of the world. So it's not just the physical fitness of their athletes that they're going to try and promote. And that, that doesn't always work well. This picture on the bottom right is of Jesse Owens, the American sprinter. He's not the only African American who succeeds quite strongly at those Olympic Games, but he's one of the most famous. He won 4 gold medals. If he's going to win, then it's going to sort of put a taint on their advocacy of the Aryan race as the pinnacle of all human development. But they also developed monumental architecture. They institute some interesting things that are still permanent in the Olympics. For example, the torch relay was designed by the Nazi government to show not just this cool connection of the torch coming from Greece from the home of the old Olympics to the new Olympics, not just sort of a neat thing where you're having the torch relayed there, but you're actually having the torch bearers pass the mantle of the pinnacle of civilization from Greece, ancient Greece, to contemporary Germany. That's what they're trying to do there, and so that we've usurped that process for something a lot less serious in the modern Olympic Games is nice and appreciated. You'll watch a clip from Olympia, which is a film that Leni Riefenstahl, who was a filmmaker in Germany at the time, made. Keep in mind with that early part that they're trying to show like that architecture shifts from Greece to Germany, that the torch of civilization shifts, that the statues who come to life are that pinnacle of humanity, those perfect statues, Greek statues, that morph into being German statues. They're going to try and show the same thing. The USSR, they certainly start way before 1976. I'm going to use 76 as sort of a point here. They didn't participate in the Olympics early on when they first were organized, but since they started, all the way through 1988, they were in 19 Olympic Games, and all of them they were first or second. And I use 1976 here because I was 9 years old, 8 or 9 years old, when the Olympics happened in 1976. And certainly, Alexeyev, the weightlifter here on the right, is someone whose image is burned in my brain from early on because those singlets, right, that's quite a remarkable little outfit he's wearing. But he won. I saw him on Wide World of Sports. I saw him in the Olympics. He was the world's strongest man. He was someone people were blown away by. Kind of this gentle giant of a guy who won more than 80 straight Olympic, not just Olympic, but weightlifting competitions. At the same time, they had Olga Korbut, who was a gymnast, who was competing in 1976. And they had sort of these two amazing examples of who they could produce as they went along. They also end up hosting, right, in 1980 Olympic Games. But they still, if you look at the medal table today, there is no Soviet Union team. There hasn't been a Soviet Union team since 1988. They're still second all time in the medal table, even though they haven't been competing since 1988. That's some remarkable performance from their athletes as they try and communicate those ideals. Another one would be Cuba. Cuba, we looked at a little bit last topic. Cuba's athletes are interesting. We looked at defecting as a way to protest against the society. Protest through defecting the ideology that's in place. Cuba, though, would point to athletes who had the chance to defect and never did as proof of the success of their ideology. So not just the medal table, but who stayed. Anna Kiro here, she's a distance runner, middle distance runner. Another guy named Teofilio Stevenson, who was a very famous boxer who won, I can't remember, 4 or 5 Olympic events. He never turned pro. He never fought Muhammad Ali. He had certainly the chance to, and people wanted him to defect often. He never did, right? So that he stayed is their point of pride. Anna Fidelia here, Quiroz, when she ran, she had just overcome a terrible incident where the cook stove in her home had exploded and set her face and part of her body on fire, and that she was able to train and come back and win was really seen as this great success. So Cuba's going to use their sporting prowess, a whole host of sports, particularly as a small country competing well and competing strongly, to show that their ideas of their regime are successful. And again, this is 1992. You remember that last one we talked about the Pan Am Games and that attempt to isolate Cuba. Pan Am Games in 1991, that was when they were trying to show that even without the Soviet backing, they were successful. 92, same sort of idea in the Olympics, they're successful, and that's the way they're going to push. And we're going to pause right now. I don't know if you heard that beep or not, but it means my chocolate chip cookies are done in the oven. Let me be right back. All right, I'm back, and there definitely are some advantages to recording at home, homemade cookies being one of them. Let's talk a little bit about China now in 2008, in the emergence of China as a sporting power. This, too, was slow in coming, much like what you had with the Soviets, where initially they're not trying to engage with the rest of the world through sport. They're sort of focused on themselves, and the question is whether sports is even worth their time. Certainly when you had the early years of the Soviet Union, there was a concern that sports was frivolous. And they were interested in the kind of thing that the fascists did, where you had that sort of mass calisthenics, where people were training on their lunch breaks and on other breaks from the factory, but they weren't interested in sport per se. But it comes to be that they recognize how hard it would be to sort of weed out that from the rest of society because sports mattered so much to so many people. The Soviets get to that point. The Chinese get to that point as well. And the head for China really comes when they get to host the Olympics in 2008. We'll look at hosting for legitimacy next and what it sort of might mean to have a place like China that has a regime that has a particular ideology and whether this will help them spread it or not. But how they do? This is a real interesting question to me. So we had all these different examples of these different regimes that tried to use sport for defining their regime and to try and show success. So you'll see here that three of them finished first in the medal tables: Germany, the USSR, and China. Italy second, though since they came from nowhere, really never really being an Olympic power before in the previous 9 Olympiads. Second was pretty amazing. The USSR maybe is the most remarkable one, right? In 76, their allies in sports finished first, second, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, and 10th. At least 3, 4, and 5 for the United States, for Great Britain, and for Australia and the like, to sort of come to the fore. So they will argue in the Cold War that that's a victory, that they're going to show success to those ideologies. The question for you and I is whether we buy this, that the extremist regimes using sports to prove their success, to showcase their ideologies, is something that's worthwhile or not. They certainly believe it was, and because of the way I know we reacted in the Cold War era, when I was young and we would win a victory over the Soviets in the Cold War sporting realm, we would feel like we had won. So perhaps it does matter, and it does mean that they are successful in those contexts.